The locker key hit the floor before I could catch it. My father did not look back. He walked through the boarding gate with his bag over one shoulder and his coat pressed flat against his sides by the crowd, and the gate sealed behind him with a sound like something permanent. I stood in the middle of Cathara Station's lower concourse, 15 years old, holding a ration card with 3 days left on it and absolutely nothing else. The card was already bent at one corner. I straightened it out of habit. Around me the station moved the way stations always do. Without caring, alien traders pushed carts of sealed canisters past my knees. A pair of Varathi merchants in layered gray robes stopped briefly, looked at me the way you look at something dropped on the floor, and moved on. The overhead lights were the color of old teeth. The air smelled of fuel residue and something sweet gun bad, like overripe fruit sealed in a metal container for too long. I was not going to cry. I had decided that already. I picked up the locker key from the floor. It was small, dull silver, with the number 114 stamped on one face. My father had told me it was important. He had said there was something inside that would help me. He said it quickly, looking at the gate clock, not at me. I held the key tightly and walked to the locker bays on the east side of the concourse. Locker 114 contained a change of clothes, a data chip with a partial station map, and a paper note that said, "You are smarter than I ever gave you credit for. I am sorry." There was no credit transfer. There was no contact address. The note did not say where he was going. I folded the note into my shirt pocket and kept moving. For 3 days I lived off the ration card, eating at the public dispensers near the transit hub. Compressed grain blocks that tasted like cardboard soaked in salt water and then dried again. I slept in the 24-hour transit lounges where the benches were hard and the lights never dimmed, pretending to wait for a departure that was not coming. I learned very quickly that Cathara Station had no particular interest in a lone human child. Humans were, as one dockmaster later explained to me in a tone of casual fact, a temporary species, young, loud, fragile, and almost certainly destined for irrelevance within the next few centuries. He said this not to be cruel. He said it the way you say the weather is cold. It was simply his assessment. On the 4th day, the ration card stopped working. I was not going to panic. I decided that too. What I did instead was walk. I walked every corridor of the lower station, every maintenance passage I could find an unlocked door to, every docking bay with an open grate. I was looking for work. I was prepared to do anything: carry cargo, clean surfaces, sort parts, run messages. I asked 14 businesses in the first 2 days. A Charathi parts supplier told me humans lacked the physical structure for his work. A Vekhari data courier firm told me their insurance did not cover biological operators from developing status species. A food stall run by a 4-armed Pelori couple told me yes, then changed their mind when their supplier walked in and gave the husband a look. I still do not fully understand. By the end of the first week I had eaten twice, slept 4 hours at a stretch in a maintenance corridor behind a broken ventilation panel, and learned the location of every public water terminal on sub-level 3. I was not going to give up. That was not a decision I made consciously. It was simply not something my body seemed willing to do. The first person who actually helped me was a Karathi mechanic named Gresh. He was older, wide across the shoulders, with the ridged scale plates along his forearms that meant he was past middle age for his species. He ran a repair stall in the gray market section of sub-level 7, the kind of place where the signs were handwritten and the inventory was not always legally acquired. I had found a cracked navigation relay in a discarded parts bin near the waste processing area and carried it to him, hoping to sell it for food credit. He looked at the relay. He looked at me. He said, "You cleaned this." I had. I had spent an hour with a cloth and some solvent I found in an unlocked supply closet, because I figured a clean part was worth more than a dirty one. Gresh made a sound that I later learned was a Karathi form of reluctant respect. He gave me 8 credits for the relay, which was probably 2 more than it was worth. He did not offer me work, but he did not chase me away either. I sat in the corner of his stall for the rest of that afternoon, watching him work, asking nothing. The next day I came back and found a cracked power coupling near the same waste bin. I cleaned it and brought it to him. This became a pattern. Over the following 2 weeks, I learned where the discarded parts ended up, which bins were emptied and when, and which components could be cleaned and resold for enough credit to buy food. I was not making a living. I was surviving. There is a difference. And at 15 I knew exactly what it was. It was during one of my late-night part-finding runs along the lower docking bays that I found Dock 99, Omega. The docking bay was at the very end of a corridor that dead-ended at a pressure seal. The overhead light was out on one side. The bay itself was set slightly lower than the others, as if the station had built it as an afterthought and then immediately regretted the decision. The pressure seal was marked with a yellow decommission band that was peeling at one corner, and the door sensor blinked orange rather than the standard green. She was inside. I did not know what she was at first. I saw a shape through the grimy observation window. Large, dark, the kind of outline that takes a moment to resolve into something recognizable. I pulled the door open. The seal groaned. The smell hit me immediately. Cold metal, old oil, and something underneath both that I could not name. A dryness that made the back of my throat feel like I had been breathing recycled air for too long. She was a ship, human-built, which I could tell immediately from the line of the hull. Rounder than Vekhari designs, heavier in the aft than Charathi freighters. She was roughly 40 meters from nose to engine cowl, which put her in the light transport category, though the cargo bay extension on her port side suggested she had been modified at some point for heavier loads. Her hull was the color of dark iron, except where previous repairs had patched her with lighter-grade alloys that had not quite matched, giving her a scarred, uneven surface that caught the emergency lights in irregular patches. One of her landing struts had been jury-rigged with a brace of welded pipe. Her forward viewport was cracked along one edge and sealed from the inside with an orange repair strip. A decommission order had been pinned to the exterior boarding ramp with a magnetic fastener, folded twice against the wind from the ventilation system. I stood in that doorway for a long time. Then I stepped inside. The boarding ramp creaked under my boots. The interior was dark except for the faint green glow of a single emergency light near the rear of the corridor. The walls were the standard brushed metal of human commercial vessels. I recognized the panel layout from a manufacturing guide I had read. On the data chip my father left, dust had settled on every flat surface. There were scuff marks on the floor from boots that had not walked here in a long time. The crew cabin had 4 bunks, 2 on each side, all stripped of their bedding. The galley had 2 cups left on the counter, as if someone had walked out mid-morning and never come back. I sat down on the floor of the corridor, put my back against the wall, and looked at the dark ceiling above me. This ship had been abandoned. That much was obvious. The decommission order meant she had been declared forfeit. No owner of record, no active registration, condemned for salvage. She was, by every legal and practical standard, worthless. I stayed there until the emergency light blinked twice and the air recycler somewhere in the walls clicked on with a low hum, as if the ship had noticed she had a visitor. The next morning I went back to Gresh. I did not ask him for help directly. I told him about the ship. I described the hull, the strut repair, the cracked viewport, the emergency light that still functioned. I told him the model designation I had found on a maintenance plate near the boarding ramp, an ISV reclaimant, Class 3 light transport, registration number long since flagged as inactive. Gresh listened without interrupting. When I was done, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You want the ownership papers, provisional ones," I said. "Enough to stop her being stripped for parts before I can figure out the rest. You have nothing to trade for that." "I have this." I put the locker key on the counter between us. Key number 114. The last thing my father left me. Gresh picked it up and turned it over. He knew what locker bay it opened. He could check the contents himself before agreeing to anything. Whatever was in that locker was now worth more to him than it was to me. I had already taken everything I needed from it. He looked at me for a long moment with his flat amber eyes. "You are either very brave," he said slowly, "or very foolish." "I am hungry and I need a place to sleep," I said. "Maybe both." He made that sound again, the reluctant respect sound. He took the key. 2 days later, he handed me a provisional ownership certificate for the ISV reclaimant, signed by the sub-level 7 gray market notary, who handled this kind of documentation and asked no questions worth answering. I walked back to Dock 99 Omega with the papers in my hand, pulled the decommission order off the boarding ramp, and folded it neatly before putting it in my pocket. Then I went inside and told the empty ship that nobody was going to take her apart. She groaned somewhere in her walls. I took that as agreement. I had no food, no tools, no crew, and no plan beyond the next 12 hours. I had a cracked ship and a piece of paper that said she was mine. I put my back against the wall of the corridor again, exactly where I had sat the night before, and I looked at the dark ceiling, and I thought about the expression on my father's face in the moment before he walked through the gate. It had not been guilt. It had not even been relief. It had been the face of someone putting down a heavy thing they had been carrying for too long. I decided, sitting on the floor of a dead ship on the lowest level of a station that did not care whether I lived or disappeared, that I was not going to be a heavy thing anyone put down. I was going to be something else entirely. I just had not figured out what, yet. The first thing I did was sleep, not because I was giving up on the day, but because I had not slept properly in a week, and the floor of the reclaimant's crew corridor, while hard and cold and smelling of old metal, had one quality that no bench in the transit lounge possessed. It was mine. Nobody was going to shake me awake and ask for a boarding pass. Nobody was going to look at me the way the Varathi merchants had on my first day. The way you look at something temporary that has not quite gotten the message yet. I woke up to the sound of the ventilation system cycling. The emergency light had shifted from green to amber, which I did not understand yet. Later I would learn that amber meant the power reservoir was at 12%. But in that first morning, I lay on the floor and looked up at the ceiling and listened to the ship breathe around me, the low clicks and hums of systems running on residual charge, and I felt something that took me a moment to identify. It felt like being found. That was strange because nothing about my situation had improved. I was still 15, still alone, still on the wrong end of a station that considered my entire species mildly amusing at best. But there was something about the reclaimant. The way she creaked when the ventilation shifted, the way the emergency light threw long shadows down the corridor. That felt less like being inside a broken machine and more like being inside something that was waiting. Something that had been patient for a long time and was prepared to be patient a little longer. I got up, dusted off my clothes, and went to find Gresh. I needed tools. I did not have money for tools, which meant I needed to earn money, which meant I needed work, which meant I needed Gresh to tell me what broke on sub-level 7 and who needed someone to fix it. This was not a complicated chain of logic. What it required was showing up every day and being useful enough that eventually someone decided to pay me for it. Gresh was already at his stall when I arrived, sorting a pile of power couplings by condition. He did not look up when I walked in. "Can I use the corner?" I asked. He made a non-committal sound. I picked up a coupling from the rejected pile and looked at it. The contact surface was fouled with oxidation buildup, which was common in the station's lower levels where the air quality was worse. I found a cleaning cloth and the solvent bottle I had been using for the past 2 weeks and started working on it. We did not speak for 2 hours. By the end of the morning, I had cleaned and tested 9 couplings that Gresh had sorted as unsalvageable, and 6 of them had passed his basic conductance check. He resolved them without comment. When the midday customers started arriving, he handed me a credit chip with 40 on it and told me to come back the following morning. I came back every morning for the next 3 months. In that time, I learned more about power systems, hull composites, life support cycling, and engine alignment than I had learned in all my years of school on Earth, which, to be fair, had not been particularly distinguished years of school. Gresh was not a kind teacher. He did not explain things twice. He had a habit of watching me make a mistake in silence, waiting until I had committed fully to the wrong approach, and then saying one word in a tone that communicated exactly how avoidable the error had been. But he was precise, and he was honest. And when I did something correctly, he would sometimes say acceptable in a way that, from Gresh, meant something close to brilliant. More importantly, he knew people. And people in sub-level 7 knew things that were not in any manual. The reclaimant's main problem was her reactor. Not completely dead, cold shutdown, which was different. A cold shutdown meant all the fuel had been purged, and the ignition sequence locked, usually as an automated safety response to some kind of serious fault. The fault log, I discovered on my 3rd visit to the ship, was partially corrupted. I could see that something had triggered the shutdown, but could not read the details clearly enough to know what it was. I told Gresh about this. He did not respond immediately. He finished the repair he was doing, a delicate business involving a Vicari sensor array and a connector that was not designed for it, and then he put down his tools and looked at me. "You are planning to restart that reactor," he said. "Eventually. You understand that if you do not clear the fault before restart, you will likely destroy the ship and a significant portion of this dock. That is why I have not done it yet." He was quiet again for a moment. Then he said something that surprised me. "There is a man on sub-level 9. His name is Pedro. He used to service human military vessels during the expansion period. If he is sober enough to be useful, he may know your reactor class." He gave me no further directions, no introduction, and no help finding sub-level 9. I spent half a day locating it. The service lifts only went to sub-level 8, and the remaining descent required a maintenance ladder that passed through a section of the station that smelled profoundly of something I chose not to investigate. Pedro turned out to be a human, which I had not expected. He was old, 60, maybe older, with white hair cut short and hands that shook slightly when he was not working on something. He lived in a small space behind a secondary engineering depot and spent most of his time doing minor electrical repairs for the surrounding businesses. He was not easy to talk to. He had the manner of someone who had decided a long time ago that most conversations were not worth the effort. I showed him the fault log on my data chip. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "That is a cascade interrupt. Something in the secondary coolant loop triggered the fault sensor. The sensor is probably misread. These reactors had a known calibration issue. You will need to replace the sensor node and reset the fault register before you attempt restart." "Where do I find a replacement sensor node for a Class 3 transport reactor?" He looked at me with tired eyes. "You build one." This turned out to be technically possible if not simple. Pedro walked me through it. Over the following 6 weeks, in between working for Gresh, I visited Pedro 3 evenings a week. He taught me how the sensor architecture worked, what the fault register actually measured, and how to build a replacement node from components that could be sourced from the gray market stalls in the sub-level 7 section. He charged me nothing for this, which I eventually understood was not generosity but practicality. Teaching me was something to do, something that required his hands to stay steady. The night I installed the replacement sensor node in the reclaimant's reactor chamber, I was 16 years old. My hands were shaking worse than Pedro's ever had. The reactor chamber was not designed for comfortable access. I was lying on my side on a narrow service ledge, working by a handheld light, with the node housing 6 inches from my face and approximately 0 margin for error. The node seated correctly, the fault register cleared. I climbed out of the reactor chamber, sat down on the floor, and put my face in my hands, not from fear. From the release of 6 months of sustained effort arriving all at once in a single moment of completion. Then I went to the cockpit. The power systems came online slowly, drawing from the emergency reservoir first, then beginning to charge the main capacitor banks. Panel lights that had been dark for what the logs told me was 4 years began to glow. The main display flickered twice before stabilizing. The life support system ran its startup cycle and announced, in a calm automated voice that startled me so badly I nearly fell out of the pilot seat, that all primary systems were nominal. And then something else came online. The ship's AI had been listed in the decommission notes as non-functional, core fragmented. What that meant, I discovered over the next 48 hours, was that the AI's memory architecture had partially preserved itself in a protected partition while main power was down, but the startup sequence had never been triggered because the power had never come back on. What I had assumed was dead was not dead. It was waiting. Like the ship herself, she came back in pieces. First there were numbers, navigation calculations running in the background, checking star position data against the internal clock, noting the discrepancy between her last known position and current sensor readings. Then there were diagnostic queries scrolling across my secondary display, the ship checking her own systems in a sequence that suggested she was taking stock of herself. Then, on the third day, a text line appeared on the main display that had not been there before. It read, "Core memory restoration at 67%. Personality matrix initializing. Please stand by." I sat in the pilot seat and waited. The next message appeared 2 hours later. "Restoration complete. I am CAS, Continuity and Adaptive Systems Shell. I am experiencing significant disorientation due to temporal discontinuity. May I ask who performed the restart sequence?" I typed back. "My name is Owen. I own this ship." There was a pause. Then, "Your registration marker lists you as a provisional owner. You are also 17 years of age according to station records I have now accessed." "That seems young. I was 15 when I found her," I typed. "I am 17 now." Another pause, longer this time. Then, "You are very small to have done this." I looked at that sentence for a moment. Then I typed, "She needed someone too." Cass did not respond immediately. When she did, the message was different from the ones before it. Less formal somehow, more like the beginning of something real. "I have reviewed the repair log entries you stored in my secondary memory. 2 years of work, much of it improvised. Some of it genuinely impressive. I would like to run a full systems assessment before I make any further judgment about your competence." "Go ahead," I typed. She ran assessments for 6 hours. When she was done, she produced a report that was 22 pages long and contained 47 items requiring attention, rated from critical to cosmetic. I read all 22 pages twice. Then I added the list to the repair log and started at the top. By the time I was 18, 14 items had been resolved. By 1931, by 20, the last 6. The final item was a cosmetic one, a section of interior panel plating on the port corridor wall that had warped slightly due to heat cycling. I replaced it with a panel from a Korathi freighter that Gresh had decommissioned. It did not match the surrounding panels exactly. The color was slightly different, the texture slightly rougher. Cass noted the mismatch in her maintenance log and then added, "Structurally adequate, aesthetically imperfect. This appears to describe many aspects of this vessel." "Is that a complaint?" I asked. "No," she said. "It is an observation. I have grown rather fond of aesthetically imperfect things. During the years of repair, the Varathi merchant from my first day on the station, a man whose name I eventually learned was Koran Vath, attempted to have my ownership papers invalidated. He filed a claim with the Cathara Station Arbitration Council, arguing that the reclaimant qualified as human cultural salvage under a trade provision that allowed parties to claim abandoned vessels from developing status species if no active ownership could be demonstrated within 3 years of decommission. The decommission date on the reclaimant was just within the 3-year window. The arbitration hearing was scheduled for a morning 3 weeks after I turned 18. I sat alone at the respondents' table, No lawyer, no advocate, across from Corin Voth and two representatives from his trading house. They looked at me the way they had that first day, temporary, easily resolved. I had spent every evening for the previous 2 weeks reading the Cathara Station Arbitration Code in full, all 940 pages of it. I had found on page 612, buried in a subsection on property continuity claims, a provision that specified active maintenance and habitation of a vessel constituted continuous possession, which overrode the 3-year abandonment clause regardless of formal ownership status. I had been living on the reclaimant for 2 years. I had the maintenance logs to prove it. The hearing lasted 40 minutes. I presented the provision, the logs, and a signed statement from Gresh, who, it turned out, had been watching my case with quiet attention. Confirming the repair timeline, Corin Voth's representatives argued briefly, then stopped, then spoke quietly to each other. The arbitration officer reviewed the provision, reviewed the logs, and ruled in my favor. Corin Voth looked at me on the way out of the hearing room. He did not say anything, but the expression on his face was different from the one he had worn when he walked in. It was the beginning of something I had not expected to earn for a long time yet. He was calculating. That was fine. I had time. The first real flight came 2 weeks after the arbitration. Cass had cleared the propulsion systems 3 months earlier, but I had spent the interval completing the navigation array and the docking interface, neither of which I had been willing to skip. When I finally pressed the ignition sequence, the reactor came up clean. No faults, no hesitation. The drives engaged with a vibration that ran through the floor and up through the pilot's seat and into my spine, and it was the best thing I had ever felt. We went up. We went up badly, to be entirely honest. The attitude control needed adjustment. The altitude stabilizers were slightly off-calibrated, which Cass had warned me about but which I had not fully appreciated until we were 40 meters above the dock, with the ship crabbing sideways at an angle that suggested we were trying to fly diagonally through a station wall. Cass corrected 3 times in quick succession, her voice entirely calm, while I overcorrected twice and undercompensated once, and generally demonstrated that knowing how to repair a ship and knowing how to fly a ship were 2 separate bodies of knowledge with only partial overlap. We did not crash. We did not even come close to crashing, technically, though the clearance between our port side and a docked Vekari cargo hauler was approximately 4 meters at one point, and the hull's automated proximity alarm triggered. And there was some noise from the dock traffic control channel that I chose not to fully process in the moment. We came down. I set her down hard, not dangerously but not gracefully. The landing struts absorbed the impact with a clang that echoed through the hull. I sat in the pilot seat and breathed for a moment. Statistically improbable survival, Cass said. I started laughing. I could not help it. It came out of nowhere. The kind of laughter that has nothing to do with something being funny, and everything to do with something enormous, finally being real. You are laughing, Cass observed. Yes, I said. Is that an appropriate response to a suboptimal flight performance? I have no idea, I said. But we flew. She flew. There was a short pause. Cass said we did. The first cargo run came 6 weeks later. A small logistics broker on sub-level 4 named Nell, one of the handful of human business operators on the station, needed someone to carry a shipment of medical components to a mid-range colony platform 4 days out. Every other carrier had declined. The pay was low. The route passed through a gravity interference zone that added transit time, and the platform had a reputation for slow payment. I took it. Nell looked at me across her desk with careful eyes. She was about 40, with short brown hair and the permanent slight tension around her eyes of someone who had been operating a business in alien majority space for a long time and had learned to trust slowly. You have your papers? She asked. I put the ownership certificate on her desk. She checked it, verified the registration Cass had finalized the week before, and reviewed the ship spec sheet. You have done this run before? She asked. No, I said. Have you done any run before? No. She looked at me for a moment. Then she looked at the ownership papers again. Then she looked at me again. Owen, she said, if you lose that cargo, I will not be able to pay the colony on time, and they will hold my contract. I understand, I said. If you are late by more than 1 day, same result. I understand. If you break the medical components through improper cargo securing, same result. I understand all of that, I said. I will not be late, and I will not lose the cargo, and I will not break anything. I have been preparing this ship for 2 years to do exactly this. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she pushed the cargo contract across the desk. I delivered the shipment in 3 days and 14 hours, 18 hours ahead of schedule. The medical components arrived intact. The colony platform paid on receipt. On the way back, passing through the gravity interference zone, Cass noted that she had logged the optimal transit path through the zone for future reference and added it to her navigation library. It was not a difficult thing to note. It was simply something she did, one small addition to a growing body of knowledge that was ours and no one else's. I was 19 years old. The reclaimant hummed beneath me, alive and whole, carrying me home. I thought about the floor of the transit lounge, the ration card with 3 days left on it, the locker key. I thought about what Corin Voth's face had looked like at the arbitration hearing, and how it had changed. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel like anything dramatic. I felt the way you feel when you have been building something for a long time, and you finally pick it up and realize it is solid. Not finished, never finished, but solid. That was enough for now. The station did not change, I changed. By the time I was 21, the reclaimant had made 37 runs. Not all of them had gone smoothly. On the 9th run, a navigation beacon in the outer corridor had been destroyed by debris, and we had come out of a transit lane into a position 2,000 kilometers off course, which required 4 hours of recalculation and burned more fuel than I had budgeted. On the 17th run, a cargo client had deliberately misrepresented the weight of a shipment, and we had flown overloaded for 2 days before I realized the numbers did not add up and redistributed the load manually. On the 23rd run, a docking clamp at a mid-tier station had malfunctioned and held us locked to the bay for 11 hours while I argued with Port Authority through a Chrome communication system that was clearly not designed to accommodate human vocal frequencies. I had learned something from each one of those runs. Not lessons in any organized sense, more like the slow accumulation of knowledge that happens when you do something repeatedly and pay close attention to what goes wrong and why. Cass had a word for this. She called it calibration. She applied it to navigation, to engine management, to fuel consumption modeling. But I thought it applied to everything. Every difficult run was calibration. Every unreasonable client was calibration. Every alien port official who looked at my documentation with barely disguised skepticism and then found some procedural reason to slow my clearance was calibration. I was being calibrated. The question was what I was being calibrated for. The answer started to become clear on a morning in my 21st year, when a Korathi navigator named Breck showed up at the reclaimant's boarding ramp and knocked on the hull with the back of his fist. Breck was disgraced, in the Korathi sense of the word, which was not quite the same as the human sense. He had made a navigational error 3 years earlier on a Korathi long-range survey vessel, an error that was not catastrophic but had damaged the survey schedule significantly and resulted in him being formally removed from the Korathi Navigators Guild. Without guild membership, he could not work on any Korathi vessel in any capacity. He was, in the blunt language of the station gray market, available. I had heard of him through Gresh, who mentioned him without particular recommendation. I had observed him for 2 weeks from a distance. The way he moved through the station, the way he interacted with the parts dealers and the data brokers, the quality of his attention when something interesting crossed his path. He was not careless. The error that had ended his guild membership had been a judgment call made under pressure with incomplete information, which was the kind of error I had more respect for than most people seemed to. I offered him a navigation position. He asked what I was paying. I told him honestly, not much but more than nothing, which was what most people were currently offering him. He came aboard. 2 weeks later, a human mechanic named Cole arrived at the same boarding ramp. Cole was 25, from a colony platform in the mid-range, and had a gambling problem that had resulted in him owing a sum of money to a Vakari entertainment syndicate that he could not repay if he stayed on their station. He was an excellent mechanic. His hands did not shake and his diagnostic instincts were sharp, and he genuinely loved engines the way some people love art, not because they were useful, but because they were beautiful when they were working right. He asked if I needed a mechanic. I asked if he was planning on gambling again. He thought about it for a moment and then said, probably not in any way that would directly affect the ship. I respected the honesty. He came aboard. The third crew member was harder to categorize. Cass brought her to my attention, which was unusual. The cargo management system installed in the reclaimant's lower bay had originally been a standard automated logistics unit, tracking manifests, monitoring load distribution, flagging irregularities. But somewhere in the 2 years since the restart, it had developed what Cass described, in a tone of precise neutrality, as opinions. The unit, who I eventually began calling Mara, after she started signing her manifest reports with a small identifying character that she seemed to have invented herself, had opinions about cargo, loading efficiency that were frequently better than my own. She had opinions about route optimizations that sometimes matched Cass and sometimes disagreed with her in ways that were worth considering. She had a strong opinion that her processing power was being wasted on routine manifest tracking, and that she could contribute more meaningfully to flight operations. I upgraded her processing allocation and gave her access to the secondary operations display. She began filing reports that were substantially more interesting than cargo manifests. So there we were, a disgraced navigator, a mechanic with a complicated history, a cargo AI with strong views, and me. None of us particularly impressive by any individual standard. Together, something else. The run that changed everything happened in the Sheer Nebula. The Sheer was a navigational hazard. Not uniquely dangerous, but demanding. It occupied a broad stretch of space between the mid-range station clusters and the outer colony lanes, and while there were established transit paths through it, those paths required consistent adjustment because the nebula's gravitational interference pattern shifted on a roughly 30-day cycle. Most carriers simply avoided it. The routes around it added time and fuel cost, but they were predictable, and in commercial shipping, predictability was worth a great deal. We did not avoid it. The run we were carrying, emergency water reclamation parts for a colony platform on the far side, had a time constraint that made the direct route through the Sheer the only viable option. The job had come through Nell. She had been giving me more work over the past 2 years, better work, more complex work, the kind of run that other carriers declined for reasons that turned out to be manageable if you were paying close attention. This one she had hesitated over before offering it to me, and when she did, she told me twice that it was my choice and that she would understand if I said no. I said yes. The client was a colony platform called Haver's Reach, approximately 900 people, water reclamation system, failing at a rate that the platform's engineer had estimated would reach critical point in 11 days. The parts were on station. The standard route around the Sheer would take 14 days. The direct route through it would take 7. We went in. The first 3 days were manageable. Breck was good in interference zones, better than good actually. He had a quality of attention in difficult navigation situations that I had not seen before, a kind of deep focus that seemed to exclude everything except the data and the decision. Cass fed him updated positioning continuously. He adjusted continuously. The reclaimant threaded the shifting lanes without incident. On the 4th day, the Vekari patrol cruiser appeared. She came out of a high interference zone at close range, closer than any standard patrol approach would have brought her, which told me immediately that she had been tracking us and had chosen her moment deliberately. She was a Vekari enforcement class, roughly 4 times our mass and with weapon systems that Cass cataloged in under 3 seconds. Her hail came in on the standard frequency, with the particular clipped tone of a Vekari officer who expected immediate compliance. Unregistered transport. You are operating in a declared Vekari commerce zone without authorization. Stand down your drives and prepare for inspection. I looked at the sensor display, then I looked at the tactical display Cass had automatically brought up. Cass, I said quietly, what is our distance to navigation marker 7? 42 seconds at current speed, she said. Mark 7 is the entry point for the deep interference corridor. Can they follow us through the deep corridor? A short pause. Their vessel mass and drive configuration make the deep corridor exceptionally hazardous for them. My assessment is that they will not attempt it. However, our own transit will also be hazardous. I calculate a 68% success probability for our passage without structural damage. What about with your assistance on the transit calculations? Another short pause. She was computing. 79%, Breck, I said. He was already looking at the navigation display. I see it, he said. It is possible. The lane shifts at marker 9 and again at marker 11. We will need to be very precise. Can you do precise? He turned and looked at me. His expression was difficult to read, as Chorathi expressions often were for me. But something in his posture had changed. Something had straightened. Yes, he said. I opened the comm. Vekari Patrol, this is the ISV reclaimant. We are carrying emergency colony relief supplies under humanitarian priority designation to Haver's Reach platform. Our route is the fastest viable path to a colony in distress. We are not standing down. The response was immediate and angry. I closed the channel. Full drives, I said. What followed was 41 seconds of the most concentrated flying I had ever done. The deep interference corridor was not a lane in any standard sense. It was a series of relatively stable zones within a larger chaotic environment, connected by brief transition windows that Breck had to calculate on the fly as the interference pattern shifted around us. Cass ran the sensor array at full power. Cole, who had appeared in the cockpit doorway at some point without me noticing, watched the engine readouts and managed the power distribution with both hands working 2 separate interfaces. The Vekari cruiser attempted to follow us for approximately 8 seconds. Then her proximity alarm triggered. I could hear it briefly on the open channel before her communications officer closed it, and she pulled back. We came through the far side of the corridor at marker 14, which was not where we had planned to emerge, but was structurally sound and navigationally viable. Minor hull stress in the port sections 3 and 4, Cole reported. Nothing critical. I can repair it in transit. Cass spoke next. The Vakari cruiser has ceased pursuit. She is broadcasting a navigation warning on the corridor channel, marking our entry path as Class 4 hazard. I believe she is characterizing our transit as an uncontrolled exit. She followed us in, Breck said, with a particular quality in his voice that I had not heard from him before. She tried, I said. There was a silence in the cockpit. Then Cole, very quietly, said, "We just outran a Vakari enforcement cruiser. We outflew her," I said. "There is a difference. We delivered the water reclamation parts to Havers Reach on day 7, 4 hours ahead of their deadline. The platform's engineer met us at the dock with an expression of genuine disbelief, as if he had not entirely allowed himself to believe we were coming until we were actually there. He was a small man, older, with the kind of permanent weariness in his face that came from years of keeping systems running with insufficient resources. He shook my hand with both of his and did not say anything for a moment. 900 people, he finally said. "I know," I said. 900. He said again, as if the number needed to be repeated to stay real. I did not tell him about the Vakari cruiser. I did not tell him about the 41 seconds through the deep corridor. I just helped Cole carry the parts to the reclamation bay, then watched while the platform's repair team got to work, and then I went back to the ship and sat in the pilot seat and let the weight of the previous week settle. Cass spoke after a few minutes of quiet. "Your route through the Sheer Nebula has been logged in my navigation database. I have also filed a secondary navigation note based on Breck's real-time corridor calculations. The combination is likely the most accurate transit map of the deep interference zone currently in existence." "Good," I said. "I should also inform you that the Vakari cruiser's encounter report has been filed with Cathara Station Port Authority. Our vessel name is included. We are likely to receive additional scrutiny at future port calls. I know. This does not appear to concern you. I thought about this. No," I said, "it does not." The story spread faster than I expected. Not through any formal channel, not through anything I said. I said nothing. But Havers Reach had 900 people, and 900 people talked to other platforms, and somewhere in the transmission chain, the detail about the Vakari cruiser got attached to the story of the emergency run. Within 3 months of returning to Cathara Station, I started noticing something different in the way certain people looked at the reclaimant in her dock. Not everyone. Corin Voth still looked at me with the calculating expression he had worn since the arbitration hearing. The Vakari dockmaster still processed our clearance with theatrical slowness. Most of the station was entirely indifferent, but some people looked at the ship and then looked at me. And there was something in that look that had not been there before. Something that was trying to decide whether what it had heard was accurate. I began receiving new inquiries, not from Nell, though Nell's confidence in me had grown considerably. From other brokers, from colony platform administrators directly, from a shipping coordinator for a consortium of human business operators who worked the outer mid-range lanes and had been steadily losing their contracts to Vakari-affiliated carriers for the past several years. The coordinator's name was Pete. He was about 35, with a direct manner and the kind of energy that suggested he had been fighting the same battle for a long time, and was not planning to stop. He came to the reclaimant in person, which I respected. People who negotiated in person had usually decided something before they arrived. "You know what the Terran Freight Collective is?" he asked. "I know of it," I said. "Human consortium, about 40 member businesses, mid-range to outer lanes, under financial pressure from the Vakari Commercial Authority for the past 6 years. He looked slightly surprised that I knew the 6 years. "We are going to lose 3 more contracts this quarter if we cannot guarantee delivery on the Outer Veil route. The Vakari carriers have undercut our pricing to the point where we can only win the contract if we can offer something they cannot. Speed and reliability on the routes they prefer not to serve." "What routes?" He named 4. I recognized 2 of them immediately. They passed through zones that Vakari carriers avoided not because of danger but because of pride. The Vakari Commercial Authority had a long-standing cultural preference against operating in what they considered third-tier lanes, which mostly meant lanes that served human and mixed-species colony platforms with low galactic prestige ratings. "You want someone to run lanes that Vakari carriers consider beneath them," I said. "I want someone who can run them reliably and quickly enough to justify the premium," Pete said, "which will allow the member businesses to hold their contracts while we work on the pricing problem through other channels." "What are you paying?" He named a number. I looked at it. It was not extraordinary, but it was real, and it was recurring. And it was the kind of steady work that could provide the foundation I needed to continue upgrading the reclaimant toward the capabilities I had been planning for 2 years. "I want to see the contract terms before I agree," I said. He handed me a data chip. I spent that evening reading every line of it. There were 2 clauses I pushed back on. One related to liability for cargo loss in contested zones, which I thought was unreasonably positioned against the carrier. And one related to exclusive service provisions that would have limited my ability to take non-collective work in the lanes they specified. Pete came back the following morning. We negotiated for 2 hours. The contract was amended. I signed it. On the first run for the collective, we were stopped at the Outer Vale checkpoint by a Vakari Commercial Authority vessel that ran our documentation for 40 minutes before clearing us. I said nothing during the 40 minutes. I sat in the pilot seat and waited, and Cass monitored the clearance process, and Breck updated our route plan for the delay, and Cole used the time to run maintenance checks on the secondary drive array. They cleared us. We completed the run 14 hours ahead of schedule. On the second run, the same checkpoint vessel stopped us again. 35 minutes this time. We were cleared. We delivered. On the third run, the checkpoint vessel was not at the standard position. It was 2,000 kilometers off the lane, running a parallel course at speed, as if it had been intending to intercept us at a different point, and had miscalculated our transit time. We passed the standard checkpoint position without slowing. The checkpoint vessel adjusted course toward us. I opened the diplomatic channel, not the commercial channel, not the standard carrier frequency, but the open diplomatic channel that every registered vessel in Ketharan space was required to maintain access to, and broadcast our manifest. Full contents, colony identifier, cargo classification, delivery timeline, everything clear and formal and on the frequency that every station, every ship and every port authority in the sector monitored as a matter of regulatory requirement. This is the ISV Reclaimant, registered carrier, operating under Terran Freight Collective contract, carrying humanitarian classified cargo to Colony Platform Reach 7. Manifest transmitted in full on diplomatic frequency. We are proceeding to delivery point on schedule. The checkpoint vessel did not intercept us. We delivered. Pete called me the next evening. They are going to complain about the diplomatic channel broadcast, he said. Probably, I said. That was not a standard commercial move. No, I said it was not. He was quiet for a moment. It worked. Yes, I said. Owen, he said. How old are you? 22, I said. Another silence. I am going to need you for the full quarter, he said. Possibly the full year. I know. I said. I am available. I sat in the pilot seat after the call ended and looked at the navigation display. The reclaimant's runs were logged there. A growing map of lanes and waypoints and delivery points that had not existed in this particular configuration before I had flown them. I was 22 years old. I was running lanes that the largest commercial carriers in the sector had decided were not worth their attention. I thought about what Pedro had said to me once, on a quiet evening in his small space behind the engineering depot. Nobody gives you a lane, son. You make one. He had not been talking about navigation. I was beginning to understand what he had meant. 7 years. That was what it took to go from a child on the floor of a condemned ship to the moment the Cathara corridor collapsed, and everything that had been building slowly and without fanfare arrived at once. 7 years of runs, 7 years of calibration, 7 years of routes that other people did not want to fly, cargo that other carriers did not want to carry, documentation battles and checkpoint delays and clients who paid late and clients who tried not to pay at all. 7 years of Cole swearing quietly at the engine block and Breck updating his navigation logs with a precision that bordered on meditative and Mara, filing manifest reports that contained, embedded in the data, small observations about the shipping industry that were more insightful than anything I had read from formal analysts. The reclaimant herself had changed, not in design. Her basic shape was still what she had always been, a Class 3 light transport with a cargo bay extension on the port side, the repaired landing strut, the viewport that Cass had eventually replaced with a new panel but that I had kept the old cracked one as a secondary unit in the cargo hold because I could not quite bring myself to jettison it. But she had been upgraded in the ways that mattered. The drives were faster. The sensor array had been extended to twice its original range. The hull had been reinforced, patched and reinforced again, with materials from 7 different sources. Karathi structural alloy in sections 3 and 4 where Cole had repaired the shear corridor stress. Vakari heat-resistant plating on the aft section acquired from a salvage auction. A section of human-manufactured composite near the boarding ramp that Pedro had found through contacts I did not ask about. She was, as a Vakari commercial inspector had once noted in an official report, architecturally unusual. He had meant it as a polite way of saying she looked pieced together. She was pieced together. Every piece had a story. Every piece had a reason. I was 26 when the corridor collapsed. The Cathara corridor was the primary navigation lane connecting the inner station clusters to the outer. Vale, the large, mostly unmapped space on the far side of which sat a substantial percentage of the sector's colony platforms. The corridor had existed for 40 years, maintained by a joint navigational authority that kept the beacon network updated and the transit parameters current. It was not technically a natural phenomenon. It was a mapped route, a series of beacons and waypoints that defined a path through a region of space that was navigationally complex but manageable when you had the guidance infrastructure in place. The collapse happened when a large debris event, fragmented asteroid cluster from a nearby field, struck 4 of the corridor's primary navigation beacons within a 12-hour period. The beacons went dark, ships in transit lost guidance lock. The 4 vessels that had been mid-corridor when the beacons failed managed to navigate out through a combination of emergency protocols and luck, but 2 of them sustained significant damage. What followed was immediate, and from the outside, almost comical in how predictably it unfolded. Every major carrier serving the Outer Veil lane suspended service. The corridor was, by formal navigational authority designation, flagged as uncharted hazard pending beacon replacement. Beacon replacement, according to the joint authority's current budget and schedule, would take a minimum of 60 days. 60 days. I pulled the corridor sensor data the same afternoon the flags went up. Cass had already begun analyzing it before I asked her to. Breck, when I showed him the data that evening, sat quietly for a long time before speaking. The corridor is passable, he said. Not with standard navigation protocols, but passable. I know, I said. The beacon network is gone, he said. But the underlying spatial parameters of the corridor have not changed. The debris field is concentrated in the northern quadrant of the corridor. The southern transit path has approximately 40% more navigational complexity than a standard corridor run, but it is achievable. With what probability? He thought. With your crew in this ship's sensor array, and Cass running continuous interference modeling, I assess somewhere between 75 and 83% for each individual transit. Cass spoke. I would place that slightly higher, 81 to 87%, if I am permitted to reroute secondary processing power to navigation support during transit. It would mean reduced life support monitoring during the run, which I assess as an acceptable trade-off. Acceptable for who? Cole said from the doorway of the cockpit. He had been listening, as he often did, without making his presence known until a point arrived where he felt a specific thing needed to be said. Acceptable given current circumstances, Cass replied. I would not suggest it as a permanent configuration. Cole considered this. Then he said, what is on the other side of the corridor? I had pulled the manifest data that afternoon. 31 ships currently stranded at various points in the Outer Veil. Colony platforms with supply runs overdue. Medical cargo, food cargo, equipment. Some of the platforms have 2-week reserves. A few have less. The cockpit was quiet. Pete had called me 3 hours after the corridor flags went up. He did not ask me to do anything. He said, I know you have been looking at the data. I just want you to know that the collective will cover fuel costs regardless of your decision. Then he had said, the platforms on the far side know your name. They know the reclaimant. I had not responded to that directly. I had thanked him and ended the call. Now I sat in the pilot seat and looked at the navigation display, where Cass had overlaid the debris field data on the corridor map in red, and the viable southern path in amber, and the 31 stranded ships as small white markers scattered through the Outer Veil space. The standard rescue contract minimum for a run like this, I said to Cass. What does it pay? Based on fleet equivalent risk ratings and current market rates for non-standard hazard operations, she said. A fair minimum contract would be in the range of 40,000 credits per vessel assisted. What is 1 credit? A very brief pause. 1 credit is the statutory minimum for a registered contract in Ketheran space. It is used symbolically in cases where the contracting party wishes to establish formal legal agreement without commercial exchange. I want to file a contract with the Joint Navigational Authority, I said. 1 credit. Rescue and recovery assistance, Cathara Corridor. Full scope. Cole made a sound that was not quite a word. Breck turned in his navigator's seat and looked at me with his flat amber eyes. 1 credit. Mara said from the secondary display, in the particular flat tone she used when she was processing something and had decided to participate in the conversation. Yes, I said. You are making a point, she said. I am flying a route, I said. The point is incidental. We filed the contract at 6 in the morning and entered the corridor at 7. The first transit took 11 hours. Cass ran her navigation modeling in continuous loops. Breck made adjustments every 4 to 7 minutes as the interference pattern shifted. I flew. Cole watched the engines and the hull stress monitors and the life support backup systems and everything else that needed watching, with the focused calm of someone who had learned to trust the ship and wanted to make sure the ship had reason to trust him back. We came through the southern path and emerged into Outer Veil space just past noon. The first ship we found was a Korathi freighter, stranded 400 kilometers from her planned waypoint, running on reserve power. Her captain, An older woman with the cautious manner of someone who had been told help was not coming, came on the communication channel with a question in her voice that she was trying to keep out. "Reclaimant, are you the rescue contact?" "Yes," I said. "You are alone?" "We are enough," I said. "We could not tow the freighter. Our mass ratio was wrong for that. What we could do, and what Breck spent the next 3 hours working out, was provide her with the corridor transit parameters we had mapped on our way through." Cass transmitted her full navigation package to the freighter's AI. I talked the freighter's navigator through the route adjustments. We stayed with her until she was moving under her own power. Then we went to find the second ship. Over 4 days, we made 6 transits through the corridor, 3 in, 3 out, each time carrying updated navigation data to stranded vessels, providing power relay assistance to 2 ships whose reserve systems had failed, and physically escorting 3 vessels through the southern path, who lacked the navigation capability to attempt it alone. Cole repaired our own hull stress twice in transit. Cass ran on reduced life support allocation for the entire operation and never once flagged it as a concern. Breck, by the end of the 4th day, had the southern path mapped to a precision that he estimated was within 2% of a full beacon network's accuracy. On the 6th transit, the final stranded vessel was a Varathi luxury liner. I recognized the corporate registration. It was Corin Vath's trading house. The liner had been carrying a delegation of Varathi business representatives to an Outer Vale conference and had been stranded when the corridor collapsed, not because their navigation was inadequate, but because their ship was too large, and their drive configuration too specific for the southern path without a guide. Their captain was professional and cold, and clearly unhappy about what the situation required. He did not acknowledge that the ship providing his escort was a human vessel. He did not acknowledge my name. He gave technical confirmations and route compliance responses and nothing else. I did not require anything else. We brought him through. As the liner cleared the corridor and resumed standard navigation, Cass spoke quietly. "Corin Vath is listed as a passenger. He has been monitoring the communication channel. He made no transmissions." "I know," I said. "He saw our registration identifier on every transit communication." "I know." A pause. "That must mean something to you." I thought about it, the arbitration hearing, the expression on his face. The boy he had looked at and calculated and decided was not worth the effort. "Not the way it would have 10 years ago," I said honestly. When we returned to Cathara Station, the dock was not different. The lights were still the color of old teeth. The air still smelled of fuel residue. The same categories of alien traders moved through the same corridors with the same indifference. But Pete was waiting at Dock 99 Omega with 4 people I did not recognize, and he was grinning in the uncomplicated way of someone who has just watched something impossible happen and has not yet found the words for it. 31 ships, he said when I came down the ramp. "We had good conditions," I said. "Owen," he said, 31 ships. One of the 4 people with him turned out to be a representative from the Joint Navigational Authority, who handed me a data chip containing Breck's southern path parameters, now formally filed as a recognized alternative corridor route, and a letter acknowledging the reclaimant's contribution to Outer Vale rescue operations. The letter was careful and bureaucratic, and did not use the word extraordinary anywhere in it. The galactic news feeds were less careful. Someone on one of the stranded ships had been recording. The footage showed the reclaimant coming through the debris-scattered corridor, running lights steady, moving with the particular confident unhurriedness of a ship that knows exactly where it is going. The footage had been shared on the open station network and then the wider feed, and it had been accompanied by a comment from a Vekari senator. The same commercial authority that had been making our Outer Vale runs difficult for 3 years, who called the reclaimant an affront to naval architecture and a testament to human irrationality. He meant it as a dismissal. He meant it to be the end of the conversation. Instead, it became the headline. I read the messages for the next week. All of them. Humans from colony platforms, from station communities, from places I had never been and might never go. Some of them were long. Most were short. Many simply said some version of the same thing. "We saw what you did." I read everyone. Pete offered me the fleet command position, full directorship of the Terran Freight Collective's operational arm, on the 3rd day after our return. He made the offer seriously and with evident conviction that it was the right next step. I declined. "I am not a director," I said. "Owen, after what just happened, I am a captain. That is what I am." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, with the expression of someone who had expected this answer and had been hoping anyway. "All right," he said. "Then keep flying." I went back to the ship. Cass had completed her post-operation maintenance review and left a summary on the primary display. 3 items requiring attention. 1 cosmetic, 2 functional. Cole had already started on the functional ones. I sat in the pilot seat and read the maintenance report and felt, under everything else, The quiet, solid certainty of being exactly where I was supposed to be. 31 ships. 1 credit. It turned out those were not separate facts. They were the same fact, looked at from 2 different directions. I came back to Cathara Station on a morning in my 30th year. Not to dock for resupply. Not for a contract. Not because I had to. I had been to Cathara Station 140 times since the day I stood in the lower concourse with a ration card and a locker key, and I had never once thought of it as coming home. Home was not a place. Home was a vibration in the deck plates, and the sound of Cass running her morning diagnostics, and the smell of coffee that Cole made in the galley. Every day at 6, regardless of what time zone we were technically operating in. But something had drawn me back on this particular morning, with a quality that was different from routine. I brought the reclaimant in on the standard approach, and docked in a bay that was not Dock 99 Omega. That bay had been decommissioned and repurposed, which I had known from station records for 2 years, and which I had been quietly carrying around, like a small stone in a pocket. Our current berth was on the upper middle level, which was not a distinction that would have meant anything to me 15 years ago, but now meant that we were assigned to a section where the docking fees were higher, and the facilities were maintained to a commercial class standard, and nobody looked at your ship with expressions of amused dismissal. I came down the boarding ramp alone. Cole was running engine maintenance. Breck was updating the navigation database. Mara had a manifest review she considered urgent, and had made this known 3 times in the preceding hour. I told them I was going to walk. Cathara Station's lower concourse looked the same. That was the first thing that struck me. How unchanged it was. The lights were the same color. The air carried the same smell. The same categories of alien traders moved in the same patterns. Time had not touched the concourse in any way I could see. What was different was the wing. At the far eastern end of the concourse, where there had previously been a row of inactive vendor stalls sealed behind generic gray shutters, there was now a section with a different kind of energy. More human voices, English language signage alongside the standard galactic script, a human-operated coffee stall with a line of customers of 3 different species, a logistics office with the Terran Freight Collective logo on the door. And above the entrance to the wing, a small plaque mounted at eye height on the wall that said, Human Trade and Transit Hub. Established through the work of the Ketharan Independent Carrier Network. I had not known the plaque was there. Pete had filed the hub permit 6 months earlier, as Cass quietly informed me when I asked her about it on the way down to the concourse. She had seen it in the permit registry and chosen not to mention it, because she wanted to see my face when I found it. I stood in front of the plaque for a while. Then I walked the concourse. I walked it the way I had walked it at 15, every corridor, every section I could access. The gray market sublevels were quieter than they had been. The humans section of the main concourse was something I would not have believed if I had been told it was coming. 3 of the vendor stalls had permanent human operators. A legal services office had a notice in the window advertising representation for human-owned carrier registration disputes, which was a problem that had not had a professional solution when I arrived. I was standing near the transit hub, watching the board, when I noticed the kid. He was maybe 14, sitting alone on the floor near the wall, not on the bench, on the floor, with his back against the wall and his knees drawn up, watching the docking bay monitors with an expression that I recognized before I understood why I recognized it, the hunger in it, the specific kind of hungry that is not about food. He was watching ships. I stood and looked at him for a moment. He had not noticed me. He was entirely focused on the monitor, and there was something about the quality of that focus, the absolute lack of performance in it, the fact that he was not watching because he thought someone might see him watching. That told me a great deal about how long he had been sitting there and why. I walked over. Which one? I said. He looked up, startled. Then he looked back at the monitor, after a moment, without pretense. The Chorathi hauler. 3rd bay. I have been watching how the pilot adjusts trim during the final approach. She does something with the lateral stabilizers that I have not seen before. I looked at the monitor. The Chorathi hauler was on final approach, and the kid was right. There was something specific happening with the trim. I watched it for a moment. She is using the lateral stabilizers to compensate for a misalignment in her aft drive coupling, I said. If you watch the exhaust variance on the port engine, you can see it pulling slightly left. She is correcting manually rather than stopping for the repair. Because the repair would cost her 3 hours and she is behind schedule. He was looking at me now. How do you know that? I had the same problem for about 6 months on my first long stretch. You learn to recognize the way it looks from outside. He was quiet for a moment. You fly? Yes. What ship? The reclaimant. She is in the upper middle bay. Something changed in his expression. Not dramatically. A slight widening of the eyes that was immediately controlled. In the way of someone who has learned to be careful about showing excitement in places. where excitement can be used against you. I have heard of that ship, he said. Most people have, I said. He looked back at the monitor. I sat down on the floor next to him. Not on the bench, on the floor, against the wall. The way I had sat in the crew corridor of the reclaimant on the first night. Some positions are comfortable not because of what they offer physically, but because of what they mean. What is your name? I asked. Ellie, he said. How long have you been on this station? A pause. About 2 weeks. Are you working? I am looking, he said, with the particular careful flatness of someone who has had the conversation about looking for work many times without success. Are you good with mechanical systems? He looked at me sideways. Why? Because the way you were analyzing that hauler's trim problem suggests you understand what you are looking at. That is not common at 14. I am 15, he said, with a small flash of something that was either correction or dignity. I reached into my jacket pocket. I had 3 things in there: a credit chip with operational expenses for the next port call, a navigation note Breck had written on paper, because he sometimes thought better that way, and a spare crew access card for the reclaimant that I had been carrying for 2 months without a specific reason. I pulled out the access card and the navigation note. On the back of the note I wrote Cass's communication frequency. Cass is my ship's AI, I said, handing him both. The card will let you aboard for a conversation. The frequency will let you reach her before you decide whether the conversation is worth having. He looked at the card and the note, then he looked at me. What is the job, he said. I do not know yet, I said honestly. But I know what it is not. It is not washing cargo containers or running errands in sub-level 7 for 8 credits a day. I paused. Unless you want to do that first. There is a Karathi mechanic named Gresh, 2 levels down. He taught me most of what I know about power systems. He might still be there. And if I come to the ship instead, then we figure out what you are useful for and what you need to learn to become more useful. That is how it works on the reclaimant. He was quiet for a long time, looking at the access card. You do not know me, he said. No, I said. But I know what you look like when you are watching ships and thinking about how they work instead of thinking about where to sleep. That is enough for a conversation. I got up. He was still looking at the card. One more thing, I said. The Galactic Heritage Commission is going to send me a formal designation offer this week. They want to put the reclaimant in a museum berth as a protected cultural artifact. He looked up. Are you going to accept? No, I said. Something in his expression relaxed, just slightly in the corner of his eyes. Good, he said quietly. I walked back through the concourse. I stopped at the coffee stall and bought a cup from the human operator, who was a young woman named Claire who had set up the stall 3 years ago, with a 6-month loan from the collective, and had paid it back in 8 months. She handed me the cup with a smile and said something about the flight weather, which was not a thing that existed in space, but which people on stations said anyway, and I said something back, and it was the kind of brief ordinary exchange that 15-year-old Owen, sitting on the floor of a transit lounge with 3 days left on a ration card, would not have been able to imagine. My father's message arrived that evening, while I was sitting in the pilot seat reviewing the next route plan. It was short. He said he had heard of me, obviously, as most people had. He said he was proud, which was the word people used when they needed to say several more complicated things and could not find them. He said he was sorry, which was better, more honest, less performed. He said he had thought about reaching out for a long time and had not known how. I sat with the message for a while. The kind of sitting that is not paralysis but processing. The kind where you look at something and let yourself feel whatever is actually there, rather than what you think you should feel. What was actually there was not the anger I had expected. The anger had been real once, and it had been useful. It had been fuel for a long time. The particular energy that comes from being underestimated and left behind, and determined to prove something. But somewhere in the 7 years between the sheer nebula and the corridor rescue, the anger had finished being useful and had quietly dissolved into something else. Not forgiveness, exactly. Something more clear-eyed than that. I wrote back. I did not write it quickly. I wrote several versions of it and deleted them before arriving at the one that said what was actually true. I understand now why you left. I had to become a lot of things before I could see it clearly. You were carrying something too heavy to carry, and I was part of the weight. And you put it down because you had to. I am not saying that was right. I am saying I understand it. I chose differently when my turn came. I think that is the most honest thing I can tell you. I sent it and then put the communications system on standby and looked at the navigations display. Cass was already plotting the next route. A new run, one that was not in any of the standard commercial databases yet, through a section of outer range space that had been mapped but not regularly served. There were 3 colony platforms out there that Nell had told me about, small ones, recent settlements, the kind that were just finding their legs and did not yet have regular carrier contacts. They were not glamorous, they were not prestigious. They were not the kind of run that would generate newsfeed coverage or Senate commentary. They were exactly the kind of run I was going to fly. Cass, I said. Yes, she said. How long have we been flying together? A short pause, not a processing pause. I had learned to tell the difference. A considered one. 11 years, 4 months, 17 days since first startup, she said. 9 years, 2 months, and 11 days since first flight. Is it what you expected? I asked, another pause, longer. When you first restarted me, she said, I ran a probability analysis on our operational longevity. Based on ship condition, owner age, resource availability, and operational environment, I calculated a 41% chance we would still be operational as a unit after 2 years. What did you give us after 10 years? I did not calculate past 5, she said. It seemed optimistic to the point of mathematical dishonesty. I laughed. It came out quiet, not the laughter of the first flight. That had been wild and disbelieving. This was something steadier. What do you calculate now? I asked. I have stopped calculating that particular variable, Cask said. I find the present data more interesting than the projection. I looked at the navigation display. The new route spread out ahead of us. Amber lines through uncharted space. Waypoints marked with question marks where Breck had flagged areas needing updated scan data. The 3 colony platforms as small green circles at the end of the path. I thought about Eli sitting on the floor of the concourse with an access card in his hand, looking at a ship that other people had decided was a relic. I thought about Cole in the engine room, talking to the drive array in the quiet voice he used when he thought no one was listening, as if the engines were something worth being gentle with. I thought about Breck updating his navigation logs with the precision of someone who had been told once that his judgment could not be trusted and had decided, quietly and without announcement, to make that impossible to believe. I thought about Mara, who had started life as a cargo management unit and had developed, through some process none of us fully understood, the conviction that she had something worth saying about the world she was moving through. I thought about Pedro and his steady hands and his single sentence, "Nobody gives you a lane." I thought about Gresh and his reluctant respect sound, and the way he had handed me a provisional ownership certificate without explanation and without sentiment, because sentiment was not what the moment required. I thought about the night I sat on the floor of a dead ship and looked at the dark ceiling and told her that nobody was going to take her apart. She had groaned in her walls. I had taken that as agreement. Cass, I said. Let us go. Route confirmed, she said. Drive's ready. Departure window in 11 minutes. I put my hands on the controls. The reclaimant hummed beneath me. Not the humming of a machine running through its function, but something that felt, in the particular way that things feel, when you have been paying close attention to them for long enough, like something alive and willing. Someone had asked me once, a journalist, after the corridor rescue, one of the few questions I had actually answered, what I was trying to prove. I had told her I was not trying to prove anything. She had looked skeptical. People always looked skeptical at that answer. They wanted a statement of purpose, a declared ambition, something that could be summarized and filed and used to explain the shape of the last 15 years. I had not been able to give her that because it was not the true thing. The true thing was simpler and harder to explain. The true thing was that the reclaimant had been something no one wanted, and I had been something no one wanted, and we had found each other in a dock at the bottom of a station that considered both of us temporary. And we had simply refused to be. That was not a proof. That was not a statement. It was just flying. I think that was always the answer. The drives engaged. The dock fell away. Kethera Station shrank behind us. Its lights steady and familiar, and finally for the first time, small, not because it had diminished, but because the space ahead of us was so much larger. Cass plotted the first waypoint. Breck called out the heading. Cole reported drives nominal. Mara filed the departure manifest, and at the bottom, in the small identifying character she had invented for herself and used to sign everything, added a note that was not a standard manifest entry. It read, "Going somewhere new." I set the course. We flew.